everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank you to those who are streaming. Hello, streaming people. I want to first give a shout out to Michelle Koch, who took the beautiful photo that you're seeing. Michelle works for Baker. Michelle, what's your position?
I'm the social media and email coordinator.
Oh, yes. She is the one all authors long to have on their side. So thank you for that. And thank you to Becky for inviting me here tonight. It's great to be here. So this book is really a story of love and books and grief and books and faith and books. And I wonder if every book, as I wrote this down, I wonder if every book is a story of love and grief in some way. For me, the love really began with a love for Michigan. And I say that to you because you're here and you might know to share that. What you see behind you is our beautiful lakeshore. And I've always loved our lakeshore. And when my husband and I have had an opportunity to live elsewhere at various times in our lives, I always felt homesick. And I thought, what is wrong with me? Am I really that parochial? Like, why am I so attached to Michigan? You know, it's not like my ancestors go back 19 generations here or anything. And then I realized eventually, especially if you're doing this work, maybe love for place is natural. And it's something I could be at peace with and maybe even indulge through books. So after a while, I started, this is after our last book came out in 2009, which is a Baker book. And I thought, well, what's next for me? And I started reading about dunes in Michigan, and I was thinking, why don't I just write about that? It never went anywhere, it just kind of sat there for a while. And now I'll tell you about the grief part. Calvin University is not the source of grief on this one at this point. But the book is really a Calvin University story because it's such a collaboration and such a result of so many of the wonderful things that happen at Calvin University. I have this photo up here. I just bought these two knight guys. You know, Calvin's mascot is the knights. I just bought these two guys, and they're going to take up residence in the English department, and I'm kind of excited about them. So this is my Calvin slide. Forgive me for indulging in that. But back to the grief issue. So I had this love for Michigan, and meanwhile, I'm part of the Festival of Faith and Writing committee, planning committee at Calvin. And I'm starting to read nature writing because I teach creative nonfiction and I'm interested in place now. So I'm reading nature writing. I'm starting to help us invite nature writers to festival. And I realized that we really want to invite Bill McKibben. So I'm pushing to have Bill McKibben here. So Bill McKibben is going to come, this really important, sort of globally important writer about climate change. And so when he came to prepare for that, I read a bunch of his books. And that's when the grief set in, because I really became convicted through his books that climate change is real and urgent. And we should all be working on it. And actually, Dwight and Tamara were there at the dinner when we took Bill McKibben out. So it's good to have that recollection and have you here to recall that. His visit to Calvin was really important to me because it kind of set me on this journey of reading. And that's where I kind of went through, as so many people do when you start to read about climate change, this period of grief. This is real. What are we going to do about it? So meanwhile, I'm starting to kind of flirt with the science people at Calvin and started getting involved in their little projects, and more or less invited myself onto this project called the Beyond Stewardship Project. So this is with my science colleagues at Calvin, and they were interested in exploring the word stewardship and trying to understand why, even though we've had all these decades at Calvin of using the word stewardship, Calvin was sort of innovative back in 1980, publishing a book through the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship called, oh Dave, what was it called again? Christian Environmental Stewardship, that's what it's called, Christian Environmental Stewardship. And my colleagues, especially Dave Mourners and Matt Hughes and some others, were sort of wondering, like, why didn't this work? You know, like, why aren't the churches falling all over themselves to work on stewardship and work on climate change? And so we got this group together, interdisciplinary group, started thinking about the word stewardship and maybe exploring, you know, like, is that the problem? Is it the word? Like, what would be beyond stewardship? So we're all trying to get beyond stewardship. So that caused me to read a lot about eco-theology. I didn't know anything about eco-theology. I knew about theology, I've read the Bible all my life, I feel like I'm fairly well educated. I mean, teaching at Calvin, you have to basically be a theologian to do this. And I started reading about eco-theology and I thought, oh, this is the missing piece. This is the piece that I have been feeling was missing in my theological understanding. I didn't even know what it was. So all of that led to more invitations for Calvin. And so that led to the visit by Kathleen D. Moore, the nature writer and philosopher, in 2019. And that's when I read her book and learned about the term Refugio, which I'm going to explain in just a minute, for those of you who haven't heard me explain it a million times. So in her book, I learned about the word Refugio, but even more important, I was even more deeply convicted about the moral imperative to deal with the climate crisis in some fruitful way, in some effective way, in some communal way. So I wrote a little piece after her visit that dealt with the idea of Refugio that appeared in the Reformed Journal, where a lot of my Calvin colleagues are too. And that summer, I see Kristen Dumais here. Kristen and I and Kevin Timpey were part of this little evil scheme we had to do public scholarship at Calvin. So we cobbled together some money and we all had a project during that summer. This is 2019. And my reason for doing a podcast was I really don't want to be on camera. So I thought, all right, well, what kind of project can I do? This was the goal of that summer. What kind of project can we do to take our academic scholarship, whatever that would be, and aim it toward a more public audience? We do that at Calvin anyway. So that's when I started this podcast, and somehow the word Refugio just seemed important to me and I wanted to explore it. So my colleague Dave Cucci, who's also here, you were the one who really encouraged me to do this. I was reluctant because I thought I have no idea what I'm doing. I still kind of don't. But Dave said, no, this is important, let's do it. So Dave has been sort of my co-host on the Refugio podcast. And so through all of this, I was exploring this idea of Refugio and thinking sooner or later I'd have to write something serious about it, but not really knowing what that was going to be. I still had this I need to write about dudes idea. And so I started visiting classes. I actually spent a whole semester visiting my colleague Deanna Van Dyke's geography class. She's a dune expert. Aeolian geography is her field. I love that phrase. Makes her sound like a ballet dancer, I think. I sat in her class for a whole semester. I'm just like slurping up all this information. Meanwhile, of course, we are dealing with crisis after crisis. And I'm learning more about the climate crisis. And you've read the news this summer. We've had 2 really rough summers in terms of extreme weather events, droughts, wildfires, floods, ocean acidification and warming, heat, species extinctions. I have been buried in this science, this reading, the news stories. So I have not only seen the headlines, but I've kind of been reading deeply into it. And so all my kind of science excitement and my eco-theology excitement is all undergirded by this sense of anxiety. And that's not all, right? We have racism and political division and an invasion in Ukraine, more every day. And then, of course, COVID hits just in time. Oh, I'll get to that in just a second. I'm watching how the church deals with crisis and starting to perceive that what I see happening quite a lot are one of 2 things. Either the church will sort of create this bunker mentality, and by the church, I know I'm being very general here, but various aspects of American Christianity in particular, responding in 2 ways to this time of crisis, this inflection point, with this convergence of crisis. One way is to sort of pretend it's not happening, like to bunker up and hide, yeah? Another way is what I've come to term the Church of Empire, and that is to double down on cultural dominance and to say, this is what we need to do. We need to be in charge. We need to hold on to power. It's kind of a desperate move. I think Kristen's book, Jesus and John Wayne, is the quintessential book on Church of the Empire. So all that's going on, and then of course, COVID hits. Just in time for me to have a sabbatical. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I kind of promised I was going to write a book here for sabbatical. This Refugio thing is taking over my life. I still kind of want to write about dunes for some reason. And meanwhile, this is about a novel, right? This is how I felt in March of 2020. So January was fabulous. I have nothing to do but read books and write all day, but I'm anguishing over how to do this. And I'm trying to do this in the midst of what looks like this, right? So if you read the first chapter of this book, Refugio Faith, and you think, what is wrong with this woman? She is so doom and gloom. Well, that's why, because this is what I was writing the introduction. But you know, it's not untrue. We are in the midst of a crisis convergence. Crisis in the sense of such upheaval. You might be surprised to learn that my actual academic specialty is early modern British literature. How did I get here? I'm still wondering. But as it happens, the early modern period in Britain is also a time of enormous upheaval in every aspect. Maybe not so much climate, but economic, political, religious upheaval. So I know that these moments of crisis are also times, really good times, to ask the question, what if? We are at an inflection point. What if things could be different? What if the church could be different? How could our faith be different for this crisis time that we haven't been prepared for, really? And we feel unequipped. What could be different? So I started to think of this Refugio model as a really generative metaphor for how to respond as people of faith at a crisis inflection point. So for those of you who are wondering what on earth is this weird word, Refugio, I will explain. And this is the example that Kathleen D. Moore uses to explain Refugio in her beautiful book, Great Tide Rising, which I highly recommend. I think I'm going to spend most of this time recommending other people's books, but that's okay. That's where the books come in, right? Love books, grief books, faith books, yes. So her example goes back to Mount St Helens in the 1980s. We have some people from Washington here tonight who remember this personally. So Mount St Helens is a beautiful mountain in Washington. This is the day before that eruption happened in 1980. It was thought to be a dormant volcano, and then it started rumbling. And people were like, she's gonna blow, and sure enough, she did. So after the eruption, it was devastation, miles around, a moonscape. And biologists looked at this and said, yeah, no, we're not gonna see green on this mountain for decades, maybe lifetimes. Just life does not come back that fast. But lo and behold, 25 years later, it looked like this. How did it green up? Well, it turns out that there are these little places of shelter under the ash, under the layers of devastation, under the death, tiny little places where mosses survived or little voles survived, and those are called refugia. This is what I read about in Kathleen D. Moore's book. So researching that a little more, I came to understand there's a whole field of biology called refugial conservation biology, where biologists study these refugial spaces. What are they? What is it about these little spaces or these particular species that allow them to survive? What is it about the conditions? What is it about the little creatures themselves, the plants or creatures themselves? So the official definition in biology is that refugia are habitats that components of biodiversity retreat to, persist in, and can potentially expand from under changing environmental conditions. So the basic idea is that refugia are pockets of life that survive in a crisis. They're places where capacities rebuild, where nature renews itself through disturbance. So this photo is 35 years after the eruption. It's taken from satellite view, of course. And you can see how quickly the mountain has actually greened up again. It's because of refugia. So naturally, being an English professor, I thought to myself, what's the metaphor here? And kind of went crazy with that. And so here's where this idea of how can we use this model to think about faithful response to a crisis moment, to an inflection point in history? And it just occurred to me the more I thought about this, that isn't this true of what we're meant to be as Christian people? Aren't we meant to be the people of Refugio, the people that shelter in a crisis, the people that protect spaces where life can renew and connect together and build capacities? Isn't that who we are? So I started to think about this. How can we think of ourselves this way and find and nurture refugia? I mean, literally in the earth in response to the climate crisis, but also in our human cultural systems, in our faith lives. Because after all, the climate crisis, Pope Francis says this himself, isn't the climate crisis also a spiritual crisis? Not only because we're experiencing it spiritually, but it's caused by spiritual sicknesses too. So how can we be people of refugia in all these ways? And really what it comes down to is how can we be healers in all these areas? The more I thought about this biblically, the more I thought, doesn't God actually really love refugia? When you think about this, if you think about the big sweeping stories of scripture, God loves to work with the hidden, the small, the inconsequential, the unlikely. Think about the history of Israel, or Noah's Ark, for example, the perfect example of a refugia, or Abraham's family, Israelites and their whole history. Even Jesus and the disciples. I mean, Jesus has not come in to conquer. He's not about bunkering up, and he's not about cultural dominance. Jesus is about planting seeds, the seeds of the disciples, the seeds of resurrection. Yeah. So the more I thought about this, the more I thought, yeah, this is the metaphor, you know? So then the book started to take shape for me. I started to think of the book as how must our faith and practice adapt for crisis times, using this refugian model. So what transformations, I started to think about it that way. What transformations are required for us to really double down on this idea of being people of resilience and healing? What do we have to leave behind? And what capacities do we have to build? And the more I thought about this, the more I thought, well, actually, we have the resources we need in the faith. We're just not always drawing on them. We've sort of forgotten, especially those of us who live really comfortable, affluent lives. We haven't had to lean on them. So it's time to lean again. So here are the transformations I came up with, and these form the chapters, the 7 chapters. So you begin in a place of despair, but we transform that despair into a posture of preparation. We begin in a place of alienation from the natural world. We transform that to a posture of kinship with the natural world, and so on, consuming to healing, avoiding to lamenting. That's the hard chapter. You thought chapter 1 was hard. Wait till you get to chapter 4. Resignation to gratitude, and so on. And I'll give you a few examples of that later. So the book is starting to take shape. And this slide is entitled, Always Have a Mother-in-Law Who Writes Poems. Because this is how this book got a publisher. So, you know, if anybody listening or anybody here is thinking, yeah, I want to publish a book someday, this story is going to make you mad. Because this is not the usual way that books get published. But my husband's mother, once in a while, writes a poem. They're lovely. And it just so happened that somebody, I don't even know who it is. Do you remember who it was, Ron? Somebody wanted to quote a poem that she wrote in a book they were writing. And they needed permissions, as you do. When you're going to quote a poem in a book, you need permissions. Well, they didn't know where to find Margie Rienstra. So they called the Calvin Worship Institute, thinking it's a Dutch name. Maybe the Calvin Worship Institute knows who she is. And the Calvin Worship Institute says, well, a matter of fact, we do know who she is. So they call my husband Ron, and he's like, yep, I know who she is. I will get your permission for you. And this turned out to be Fortress Press. So Fortress Press needed these permissions. So Beth Gady, who's an acquisitions editor at Fortress, she just retired actually, but Beth Gady is on the phone with Ron, going, yes, give me your mother's information. And then being a good acquisitions editor, she says to Ron, so you got a book in you? She says, we're really hoping to acquire books on preaching. Ron's a preaching professor. And Ron, being the fabulous husband that he is, goes, well, I don't really have anything about preaching, but my wife has a book, and he gives a little pitch that he did eloquently, I'm sure. And she's like, yeah, sure, send me a proposal. So I sent her kind of a brief proposal, and we started getting, in conversation. We had a Zoom meeting. Remember, this is during COVID. We had a Zoom meeting, and one thing led to another, and they acquired the book. So this picture was taken by my mother-in-law, and the moral of the story is always have a mother-in-law who writes poems. All right, so as the book came together, I had this kind of theological piece. Like, I knew what the theological structure of it was going to be. And I also wanted to, this is like a really bad way to create a book as an author. I have 5 things I want to write about. I'm going to do it all in one book. Not a good plan, but it worked out, I would say, providentially. So the other thing I really wanted to do was organize the theological themes by the liturgical year. I go to the Church of the Servant, as some of my wonderful Church of the Servant colleagues here, peers, fellow congregation members here tonight. And we are very serious about the liturgical year. And so that has shaped me over 26 years, that living week to week in that liturgical year has really shaped me. It is just how I organize my theological thinking. So the 7 chapters are mapped out across the liturgical year in ways I'll demonstrate in just a minute. But meanwhile, I still want to write about dunes. So the book has value-added nature writing in it. And I'm actually going to read a little bit of nature writing from the book now. So I decided to do these interstitial chapters, partly to indulge my desire to write about dunes, but also to demonstrate that becoming people of Refugio is about reconnecting to place. And learning about where you are, learning about your watershed, learning about the unique features of where you are, and the unique damage that where you live might be experiencing, and the particular ways that your place needs to be healed. So I started to take all these journal entries that I've had over the years, and I literally went through all my journals and typed up all the stuff about dunes. And then edited madly, revised and edited madly. So this is the opening interstitial chapter. So each chapter has a little kind of dune essay, very creative writing like dune essay before we get into heavy theology. So this is the opening one. October, Douglas, Michigan. It's been raining and raining and raining, and now the wind comes, taking long, hard breaths across the water. I love this weather out at the lake, as long as I'm sitting cozy under a blanket inside the warm cottage. I imagine being out on the dunes today. With the right gear, it could be exciting for a while. Wellies, a warm sweater, a good rain jacket with a sturdy hood cinched around my face. The lake churning indifferently. The wind, though. The Great Lake is ever-changing, implacable, profoundly wild. Even on days when the water is gentle and the breeze warm, you still feel as if you are somehow caught in the pocket of wild forces. The mildness, only a momentary reprieve. The lake says, delicate beauties are brief. What lasts is tough and unglamorous, tenacious, companioned to the wind. I walked north on the beach the other day and then turned back into the southwesterly wind. My eyes watered and smarted, and I had to keep one eye closed and push on half blind. You know what this is like walking on a windy beach, yeah? The sun was searing white, but offered little warmth, slipping at intervals behind steely clouds. The trees trembled, the lake tossed, its choppy surface metallic. By 6:30, darkness swallowed all but the roar of the waves, and I was safe in the quiet stronghold of our little family cottage. I have been thirsty for silence, glad for this place to be alone. Here inside the silence on the edge of wildness, I wonder what my work might be now in my older years, in these crisis times. What might God say to me if I can be quiet enough to listen? What did God mean a few months ago when I heard in the scriptures, in my prayers, I am making all things new? How shall I look for new life when everything seems chaotic, churning with sorrows both ancient and fresh? Most of us long for steadiness, but instead we must adapt constantly. We live in an age of upheaval. We must be tenacious and tough. I'm watching a cottonwood dance in the wind. It's a tall, slim thing, like a fringed flagpole, but pliant as rubber. It bends and dips in the gusts. If it snapped at the waist, I wouldn't be surprised, but its roots are strong. It's sap full of dreams. So each of those chapters has a kind of oblique thematic relationship with the theology stuff that comes in the chapter next. So if you read through the book with that in mind, you might be able to sort of detect how those interstitial journey chapters were chosen to fit the chapter that follows. So this was intended to embody the importance of connection. But there's more. As a super value added extra bonus, I also thought, this book has to be beautiful. It has to evoke our love for the beauty of the world. So there has to be a kind of beauty to the book. And the editor Beth definitely agreed with me. Authors can be such a pain. They have ideas, they have ideas. I had lots of ideas, but she was very generous about it and agreed. So I sent her all kinds of ideas for the book design, the interior book design. I mean, authors should not do this, but I did. She was very soft about that. And I also thought, wouldn't it be beautiful to have illustrations, some kind of illustrations? And I happen to have a student, Gabrielle Eisma at Calvin, who is an enormously talented artist. She can do anything. And so I got a grant from Calvin. Once more, this is a yay for Calvin moment. Got a grant from Calvin to pay her to do this art. So she was willing to share with me some of her process, so I can share that with you. So you can see her reference photos here. This is a picture of Buckthorn, which is actually the villain in the book. Yes, my husband's like shuddering from trauma. Buckthorn is a non-native invasive, and our little property, our tiny little 1/3 acre, was just lined with a 20-foot hedge of buckthorn, which took us like 5 years to get rid of. So I talk about that in the book, and buckthorn is really the villain of the book. As villains go, pretty mild stuff, right? But we also wanted to do like particular Michigan creatures and plants that were mentioned and important in the book. So here's her beautiful chickadee. This is cottonwood, which starts out as a villain and then kind of becomes a hero in the book. So I just wanted to share with you those. So I'll give you a few examples of what these transformations look like as I play them out in the chapters. Just a few. Are we doing on time? We're doing okay. So the first chapter is associated with Advent. So if we're going to begin a book, we have to begin at the beginning of the liturgical year in my little scene. So we're going to begin with Advent. And so here's where I wanted to place that beginning point of despair. Because to be honest, we all have this feeling of despair from time to time, if not sort of as an underlying thing, what's happening in our world. There's so much conflict, so much trouble, and climate change. But we have the equipment, as I was saying before, in our faith to deal with despair and understand it as a place perhaps of wilderness. And the potential in wilderness in the scriptures is always that it becomes a place of God's presence and a place of preparation. So to think about John the Baptist in Advent as the figure of wilderness, and to hear John the Baptist saying, in the wilderness, prepare the way. This was ringing in my ears as I was thinking about this. So here's where we think about our grief and go through this process of, sometimes it's called deconstruction, but in particular, I mean this sorting process of what do we need to leave behind that we've been carrying with us? What kind of baggage do we have to leave back in Egypt? Actually, Chuck, you're here. You know about leaving Egypt. Where did Chuck go? Yes, Chuck wrote a whole book called Leaving Egypt, right? Yeah. So I'm just taking like an ecological version of that. I think I quote you in the book too. Yeah. Look at the footnotes. So this idea of what kind of baggage do we have to leave behind? And what is God preparing us for? There's a kind of paring down process, and it's a severe and merciful process. But if we think about it as not just wallowing in despair, but being in a place of wilderness where God is known to dwell. How powerful is that as a transforming posture? All right, now we're going to take a break because the book is also full of examples. So a little citing of a real life refugium. By the way, refugium is the singular, and I often forget to say it that way, but refugia is plural, refugium is singular. But honestly, I'm engaged in a whole grammatical invention system here where I keep making up words having to do with refugia. So refugia citing, and here's a shout out to the great Plaster Creek Stewards group at Calvin. In fact, Gail Hefner is here, she's been a part of this. And many of you who've been involved at Calvin have been a part of Plaster Creek Stewards. They do watershed restoration. They've been doing it for 15 years. They're the ones that helped us deal with our villainous buckthorn. And they do community outreach and education and research. Students are involved. They are literally healing the Plaster Creek watershed. So it's just this really literal, beautiful example of refugial work. There I go. See, I made up an adjective, refugial. We'll skip to transformation 3 now, just to give you a couple more examples. So this is consuming to healing, which winds up landing in the Epiphany season. And for Epiphany, we think about the life of Christ, the revelation of God through Christ. And so I thought a lot about Jesus as a healer and all those healing stories and how beautiful they are, and also how incomplete. Jesus does not heal everybody, and that really bugs me. But I think the reason for that is that we are to take over that vocation and to become healers. So not just stewards, but actually healers. And here's where we get beyond stewardship, right? There's lots of problems with stewardship, and I talk about this in the book. But one of the problems is that it really doesn't quite express the urgency and the need for healing. It seems to be content with a status quo. And that just can't be the case. So what can we do to become healers? This is beyond our Genesis vocation. We are not in the Garden of Eden anymore. We are on a damaged earth. So we have to think about it that way. And that's a different relationship to land, not asking what do we want or water. What do we want, but what needs healing and how can we help? I'll talk about Randy Wigley in just a second. Oh no, I won't. Yes, I will. I'll talk about him in just a second. So a little break for Refugio sighting. This is another local one. There's a church in Granville, Michigan that used to be, I think it was called Trinity Christian Reformed. They completely remade themselves. They're now called the Refuge. And they focus on, they call it outdoor discipleship. They're also healing a watershed. This is what they do with their youth group. They don't have like lock-ins. They go out and do macroinvertebrate studies. I'm not even kidding. If you listen to my podcast, I'll interview the pastor of this church. That episode will be released in about 4 weeks, I think. Jerry Koenig is his name. And he describes this. It's wonderful. It's so right in the mud and specific. They have an amazing youth program there because they get them outdoors and they do this together. They're also very concerned with refugees. So they are a refugium in that sense as well. And they are very committed to inclusion of people with disabilities. So they are creating in the church these refugia spaces in lots of different ways and connecting them up with other things. Transformation number 6. So this is the second to the last chapter, from passivity to citizenship. The image you're seeing there is a church forest of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has this long theological tradition of caring for the forest around the church. They think of it in terms of circles. So the church itself is at the center and it's circular. And then you need to have this kind of Edenic forest around. The church's job is to care for this forest. And because of that theological, very ancient theological commitment, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has managed to save these literal refugia of biodiversity when so much of Ethiopia has been deforested for animal grazing. So you can see how deforested it is around that. And so they did this for theological reasons. And now they're beginning to realize with the help of biologists, actually what you've done is save biodiversity here. So they're working now on like expanding the walls around those. Anyway, this chapter is about Pentecost, the work of the Spirit. And the idea that so often, I think we have this image in our mind of being people of faith as God is the powerful force in the sky, and our job is to bow down and worship. And it can become very passive. It can become almost infantile. And so I look to a passage like John 15, this is the Last Supper, and Jesus saying, you know, servants don't know what their masters are thinking, but I'm called you friends. And so Jesus invites us, I think, into this resurrection community of agency and responsibility. And that is so desperately needed right now. So the way I've described this is passivity to citizenship. And of course, we don't necessarily want to do it. It's hard. It's costly. It might even be painful. It's frightening, but we do this by the work of the Spirit. So here's Randy Wigley. He is a Christian pastor. He's also a member of the Kituwa Band of Cherokee. And he has this regenerative agriculture center in Oregon where he provides education, particularly to Indigenous people, to reclaim Indigenous land practices and to teach regenerative agriculture. So just another really great example of somebody doing refugio work very literally. So just to sum up, some characteristics of these refugio spaces. These are themes that kind of get repeated throughout the book. And then to sum this, sorry, that was fast. And then to sum this up, refugee are meaningful in the natural world because they protect, they transform, they connect and revive. So that's kind of the biological basis of the metaphor here. And always in ways particular to that place and that context and that time. So in human culture, I think this metaphor applies, but it gets even more complex. So Refugio provides safe spaces, yes, to cultivate all kinds of health, both ecosystem health, cultural, spiritual community. They create freedom to experiment within these little slightly protected spaces. They're never entirely safe, of course. There's freedom to experiment. And one of my favorite things about Refugio is that small does not mean insignificant. And I think this is a deeply Christian principle. Small does not mean insignificant. And so we see this literally in biology, but I think it's something to remember now when we do feel that these crises are so big. So we build inclusivity in Refugio through permeable edges. They are not bunkers, they don't have walls. That is definitely not the point. They have to be able to spread, to welcome, to have passage in and out. And it's through that permeability and the spreading and connecting that Refugio spaces can build influence through that network. So this is something I've really been working on in the podcast too, is asking people to think with me about scale. And I talk about this in the book too. The question of scale, you know, we can do our small little things, but how is that big enough or fast enough to really make a big difference and change? And the Refugio model suggests, well, it's not, but you're doing it with other Refugio spaces. So that connection, we talk about wildlife corridors, for example. That's an example of building connections among Refugio, and that makes that small corridor can make a huge difference. So that leveraging the scale is really interesting. And finally, they model both challenge and joy. They're challenging places, but they're also joyful places. They're places of agency and change. So this is what I would leave you with. I mean, this is really the thought experiment of the book itself. What does it mean for you to think of yourself, your church, as a place of Refugio? What does it mean to be the people of Refugio in the name of Christ? So thank you. So I guess we have time for questions. Yeah, this is the plan. So I would love to have a little conversation with you. What are you thinking about? What questions do you have? What does this evoke in you? Yes.
I just have a question about your buckthorn because
She wants to know about buckthorn. Yeah.
because in the book you talk about it, you're having some success, and so I think
Yeah.
what you did in your backyard was very, very interesting. And so, what are some successes that you've had in your backyard?
Oh,
Right?
with the buckthorn. Yes. So I had a conversation with this guy called Michael Reiskamp, who used to be in charge of Plaster Creek Stewart. So early on in our process, we're standing out there, like up to our knees in mud. And we had this conversation about whether or not buckthorn was totally depraved. It was just the funniest thing. Like, Where else would this happen? So just to be fair to buckthorn, it's not an evil plant. It's just, it wasn't meant for here. So it's a non-native invasive, right? It's perfectly fine in Europe or wherever it came from. I think Europe. But here it tends to take over. It tends to change the soil pH so that nothing else will grow. It spews tons of berries that give birds diarrhea. I mean, yeah, it's bad. So we did manage to get rid of almost all the buckthorn, and I think one success is convincing our neighbors to do it too. So they are way into this now as well. And we've also, with the help of Plaster Creek Stewards, created what's now called meadow gardening. So we have wildflowers, native plants back there. And that's in year 3 and it's doing great. And the pollinators are just losing their minds. They're so excited about it. We've also put on solar panels. I mean, that's not a yard thing, but it's a household thing. We have solar panels, we have electric vehicles now. And we're lucky that we have the ability to do that. Not everybody does. The Inflation Reduction Act will help. But we just love this stuff. Now we've taken to, riding up and down the streets going, oh, I'll never go back to an ICE. Never. That means internal combustion engine. Yeah. So I would say the yard is on its way. We still have lawn, we still mow our lawn, that's okay. But the refugium, of course we call it a refugium. The wildflower area is slowly creeping into the lawn and we're like, yeah, good, do it. Yeah, so does that answer your question about, about buckthorn? Yeah, good. Other questions? Or just things you want to say, that's fine too.
What's your next book?
Oh man, what's your next book? He asks me. Still recovering from this one. Thank you for that question. Well, actually, we are sort of thinking, and by we I mean Ron and I. So I introduced Ron a little bit. So he's a professor of worship and preaching, and what is your title now? Director of Worship Arts or something?
Worship Life.
Worship Life, Director of Worship Life at Western Theological Seminary in Holland. And we've been thinking that what might actually be really helpful for people is a book called Refugio Church, which is just all examples of what people are doing in their churches and how it could be helpful. So that's sort of a pipe dream on the horizon. I think it's going to have to happen. I do feel like this whole Refugio thing is like taking over my life. Like, what happened? I don't feel like I'm in control of it anymore. It's just sort of running me. What's that?
It's invasive.
It's invasive. This refugee idea is invasive. What I'm working on hard right now, besides talking about the book to people, is the podcast. So I did 2 seasons. We survived that first summer. Kristen did her stuff, and I did my first pretty amateurish season of the podcast. Nevertheless, had wonderful conversations. I mean, the production values are, but the conversations themselves are wonderful, and I think very much worth going back to. Season 2 was better. Bill McKibben was on that season. That was an amazing conversation. And every time I swore I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to do it again. It's too much work. So of course I'm doing season 3. So season 3 started releasing on Sunday, and I'm really emphasizing toward this next book, really emphasizing church. What does it look like in church? So if you find the podcast, I think, yeah, so you can, everything, if you want to find anything about me, just go to my website, it's all there. But if you find the podcast, you can search on podcast platforms for it too. This is just where I have deep conversations with people to kind of explore this idea more. So there's stuff in the book that came from season 1 and 2. There's a lot of stuff I was writing in the Reformed Journal that got rehashed and revised into the book. And so I'm hoping that this season 3 of the podcast is kind of on its way to exploring some of these issues. Like Dave Grucci is going to come back at the end of the season and do another episode with me where we're going to kind of look back on the themes of the season and say, okay, so what did we learn? So the book, it's partly I did all the reading, so you don't have to kind of thing. Like I read all the books you have to, which isn't really true because the minute I turned in the manuscript, more good books came out. And I also figured out other books that I kind of missed along the way. So as any book is, it's like a moment in time. It was the most I could possibly do at that moment in time, but it keeps rolling out. And a book is really a way to enter a conversation. And that's what I valued about this process. More than anything else, the acknowledgments page is my favorite section of the book, because it's my way of showing gratitude to all the people who have taught me things and collaborated along the way and revitalized my ways of thinking about theology and about even my own field of British literature. You wouldn't believe the eco-criticism stuff I get in my classes now, my poor students. But it's fascinating, and they find it kind of exciting too, I think. So it just kind of continues to roll out, and I'm meeting new people and having new conversations and learning more about it. So that's really been, for me, the most valuable part of this whole process. Dan?
I think I remember you saying that the experience of writing chapter 4, from avoiding to lamenting, there was something extraordinary and intense about that in comparison with writing the rest of the book. First, did I hear that right? And second,
Yes.
could you talk a bit more about that?
Oh. I should care more about people than animals, I think, maybe. But there's something about species extinction that really got to me. So when I did the research for chapter 4, which is the Lenten chapter, I did a lot of research on species extinction, and I think maybe it just hit me so hard because there's no way any of this is their fault, right? And the finality of species that go extinct. And the danger, there's, I don't have the statistics right off the top of my head, they're in the book. They are pretty grim. 1/3 of some categories of creatures are endangered, of some degree of endanger. And we are seeing rates of extinction higher than the background rate, right? So there's always extinctions, they're always happening. That's called the background rate. We're seeing rates, the conservative estimate is 100 times faster than the background rate. That's the conservative estimate. There's a whole website where the science people who track populations sort of gather and assimilate all the data, and that's sort of kept up dynamically. So you can actually go to that website, it's listed in the book. And I think there was just something about the finality of it and the fact that this is us doing this. And then the idea that these are creatures of God that we are destroying, that are just losing their voice of praise to the Creator because we are silencing that voice. And I don't know why that strikes me more than like the suffering of people in Afghanistan. It's terrible. But I think it might be, not that I think, people who are experiencing the hurricane in Puerto Rico and the floods in Pakistan, it's not their fault either. So the most vulnerable people, and this is the basic principle of moral injustice in the climate crisis. The most vulnerable people are the ones who have done the least to cause the climate crisis. They are experiencing the effects first and worst. So that big justice issue is definitely there. Why it was the dying creatures that hit me more, I don't know. But yeah, doing that and the finality of it, that was my real despair moment, even though it wasn't the chapter on despair. Why is that question interesting to you? I'm curious.
Oh, what you said about writing that chapter just caught my attention.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
curious to hear more about it.
Yeah, it was not an easy book to write, but I think the Refugio model is, I hesitate to say the word hopeful, because my ideas about hope have changed. My ideas about hope are not, oh, it's all going to be fine, and that is what hope means to me. My ideas about hope now are more, hope is an action. Hope is the faithful work that we do, regardless of the facts on the ground. That's what hope is to me now. And hope is also the amazing people who are working on this. Some of them are Christians, many of them are not. Many of them are people of all kinds of faiths. And the most exciting and joyful part of going through these places of real grief is seeing who else is there with you and what they're doing to work together. So when people say, you know, what can I do? It's such a huge thing. The climate crisis is such a huge thing. Don't be just one person. That's the standard word of advice. Find community, find agency are the two things that I would say. And that has been where I would say, you know, my chastened hope is in the community of people that I have met or read about or seen on Twitter. The community of people, the amazing work they're doing. I can't help but think this is the spirit of God at work in these amazing people. And the joy of doing something, the sense of purpose and agency that is so helpful. That is the antidote to despair, I think. Agency and community. Yeah, good, thanks. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, I mentioned to you, this to you a while ago. I gave a talk in March on what if the Commissioner of Higher Education wasn't healing. And I flew over to Hungary to give this, so I had your book on the plane,
Oh,
flying there.
Yeah.
And by the time I got there, I knew that I needed to quote you pretty extensive in this talk. And I want to thank you for that chapter on healing and the way that you said, where are the wounds? What needs healing and how can I help?
yeah,
I love that, and the people in Hungary where I talk, love that too, and
Oh,
just
so
really
glad.
love it. So
thank you for
I
sharing.
just want to thank you for that.
Yeah, I think people in Hungary need Refugio. They have worse problems than we do here.
And Christian higher ed, I think, can be part of it.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Mhm. All right, Dave, what you got for me here?
Debra, you've had such a fun time connecting with all of these different people that you invited to your podcast.
Yes.
And it's not like they have the word Refugio on their websites. You know, how did you go about finding these
Oh, how did I
folks?
find them?
And then tell us also a little bit about what you learned about how this refugium concept is such a pliable,
Yeah,
helpful concept that can be it's applicable in so many different ways.
yeah.
What did you learn about that?
Wow. How do I find the people? Well, this is the beauty of higher education, right? You make connections with people, and if you don't know them, you know somebody who knows them. Bill McKibben is an enormously generous person, just ridiculously generous. And seems to be about 10 people. He has an amazing capacity. And the fact that we had him at Calvin was the connection there. This season, I'm getting braver and sending out cold emails. It helps to have an actual book and say, here's my book. And to have a website that people can go and make sure you're not some crazy person. Well, maybe you are, but at least you have a website. So I've been a little braver about asking people, and that's because I feel like I've spent more time in this kind of conversational space. So I know the layout a little better, so I can make a better case to have conversations with people. But a lot of it is just people I read. And then, authors are always happy to talk if you mention their book's name, just a little word to the wise there. So Leah Shade, for example, I didn't know Leah Shade. She's my first episode this season. Ron actually knew her, which helped. But I sent her an email and said, read your books, love them. Here's my idea. Do you want to talk about it? And she immediately thought, oh my gosh, that is the word that describes what I've been trying to do. I just did not have the word for it. So I get that a lot. And you do too. I know when you talk about the Refugio idea, you get that a lot too. So it's just, it seems to be a concept that captures something that people are longing for. Yeah, and that's been really exciting. And that's kind of why I keep doing this, because it feels like people are grateful to have this idea. It feels like a way forward that is deeply Christian, even though it's not a word that's in our Christian vocabulary until now. Yeah, thank you for that question. How are you doing? People need coffee and pastries.